What if I told you that one man's prayer could heal the blind, the deaf, and even the paralyzed, yet his life was filled with controversy that shook the nation? This is the story of A. Allen, a man whose ministry performed miracles that left thousands in awe and whose personal struggles sparked questions that still echo today. From dramatic healings in massive gospel tents to moments of intense scrutiny, his life challenges everything we think we know about faith, human imperfection, and divine power. In this video, you'll witness astonishing testimonies of miraculous healing, uncover the controversies surrounding Allen's ministry, and explore the truth behind the headlines. Stay with us because the story is far more incredible and complex than most people realize. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it so more people can experience this extraordinary story. Imagine this for a moment. A man steps onto a wooden platform under a massive gospel tent. The air is thick with dust, sweat, and expectation. People have traveled for days, some carried on stretchers, some led by the hands of loved ones, some unable to hear a single word being spoken. Wheelchairs line the front row, crutches lean against folding chairs, blind eyes stare into darkness, deaf ears strain for a sound they have never known. And then, the man begins to pray. No special lighting, no background music, just a voice, firm, trembling, authoritative, calling on the name of Jesus Christ. Moments later, the impossible seems to happen. The blind claim they can see, the deaf say they can hear, the paralyzed rise to their feet. This was not a scene from a movie. This was not a staged performance. This was the world of Evangelist A. Allen. For many, A. Allen was one of the most powerful miracle preachers America had ever seen, a man whose prayers were said to unlock divine healing on a scale rarely witnessed, a man whose meetings were filled with testimonies so dramatic they stunned entire cities, a man who boldly declared that the God of the Bible was not dead, not distant, and not silent. But behind the miracles, behind the prayer, behind the crowds, there was controversy. And that controversy would eventually threaten to overshadow everything. This is not a story meant to destroy a legacy. This is not a story meant to glorify scandal. This is a story meant to tell the truth, carefully, honestly, and completely. Because the life of A. Allen forces us to wrestle with uncomfortable questions. Can God use a flawed man? Can genuine miracles exist alongside human weakness? And what happens when the headlines become louder than the prayers? Before the controversy, before the accusations, before the whispers, there was a calling. Asa Alonzo Allen was born into deep poverty in the early 20th century. His childhood was marked by instability, hardship, and pain. Alcoholism ran through his family like a curse, leaving scars long before he ever stepped behind a pulpit. From a young age, Allen knew struggle, not as a concept, but as a daily reality. Yet somewhere in the middle of that brokenness, something happened. Allen encountered God. Not religion, not tradition, but a deeply personal, life-altering experience that would redirect the course of his life forever. He later testified that he was dramatically saved and called by God, abandoning a life of sin and desperation for one of total surrender. Prayer became the center of his existence, not casual prayer, but intense, desperate, all-night prayer. Prayer that shook him, prayer that humbled him, prayer that convinced him that God still healed the sick. And Allen didn't just believe it, he preached it. In the post-World War II healing revival era, America was spiritually hungry. Evangelists filled tents across the nation, and A. Allen quickly became one of the most recognizable names among them. His meetings were raw, loud, emotional, and unforgettable. But what truly set him apart were the claims of healing through prayer. Not vague improvements, not slow recoveries, but sudden, dramatic transformations. Eyewitnesses reported blind eyes opening instantly, deaf ears responding to sound for the first time, men and women who had not walked in years standing up under the power of prayer, medical braces discarded, wheelchairs left behind. Allen insisted it was not his power. Again and again he pointed upward. "It is Jesus Christ who heals," he would say, and thousands believed him. His ministry grew rapidly. Radio broadcasts carried his voice into homes across the nation. Testimonies flooded in, crowds swelled, donations increased, and with growth came scrutiny. Skeptics questioned the miracles. Journalists attended meetings with notebooks instead of Bibles. Doctors demanded medical proof. Some healings were verified, others were disputed, and slowly a tension began to form between faith and doubt. Still, A. Allen pressed forward. He fasted, he prayed, he preached with urgency. But behind the scenes, the pressure was mounting. To carry the expectations of thousands, to live constantly in the public eye, to be seen as a vessel of God's power, that weight can crush a man. The same prayer life that fueled Allen's ministry also exposed his humanity, because prayer does not remove weakness, it reveals it. And while Allen preached deliverance to others, he quietly battled his own inner demons. This is where the story becomes complicated. This is where heroes become human, because the same man who prayed for the blind to see was not immune to struggle. The same voice that commanded sickness to leave bodies wrestled privately with exhaustion, stress, and past wounds that never fully healed. And then came the moment that would change everything. An arrest, a headline, a wave of public controversy that spread faster than any miracle testimony ever had. Suddenly, the question was no longer, did God heal? It became, can this man be trusted? Some turned away instantly. Others defended him fiercely. Many were confused. Was A. Allen a true man of God who stumbled? Or was his entire ministry a deception waiting to be exposed? The truth is far more complex than either extreme, and to understand it, we must slow down, look beyond the shouting crowds and angry critics, and examine what really happened next. Because the controversy did not end his story. In many ways, it defined it. And in the next section, we will step deeper into the peak of A. Allen's miracle ministry, examining documented healings, eyewitness testimonies, and the prayer practices that made his meetings so powerful before the storm finally broke. This is only the beginning. By the time A. Allen reached the height of his ministry, his name no longer needed introduction. Cities knew him before he arrived. Newspapers announced his crusades days in advance. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to promote his meetings. Entire communities leaned forward with anticipation, wondering if this would be the night that prayer would change everything. And for many, it did. Allen's healing services followed a familiar but intense rhythm. Worship would swell the atmosphere. Testimonies from previous meetings would be read aloud, stories of cancer disappearing, of twisted limbs straightening, of hearing restored after decades of silence. Then Allen would step forward, Bible in hand, eyes burning with conviction. He preached prayer not as ritual, but as warfare. Prayer, he said, was not polite. Prayer was not passive. Prayer was a collision between heaven and earth. He taught that healing flowed through faith-filled prayer, anchored in Scripture and empowered by the Holy Spirit. And when he prayed, it was with authority that startled even seasoned churchgoers. Eyewitness accounts describe moments of sudden stillness followed by explosive reactions. A man shouting that he could see the color of his wife's dress for the first time. A child clapping at sounds previously unknown. A woman stepping out of a wheelchair as the crowd erupted. Crutches piled up at the altar. Braces were lifted overhead. Doctors' letters were read publicly. Some healings were documented with medical confirmation. Others lived only in the testimonies of those who experienced them. To believers, this was undeniable proof of God's power. To skeptics, it was cause for alarm. But what cannot be denied is this: people kept coming. Not just the desperate, not just the hopeful, but pastors, missionaries, and even medical professionals, curious, cautious, sometimes critical, yet unable to ignore what they were seeing. Allen's ministry expanded rapidly. He established Miracle Valley in Arizona, envisioned as a spiritual training ground for revivalists and prayer warriors. He launched large-scale evangelistic campaigns and invested heavily in spreading the message that prayer still healed. And yet, behind the pulpit strength, there was a cost. Allen prayed for others constantly, but the demands never stopped. Long nights, endless travel, financial pressures, spiritual attacks, and the weight of thousands expecting miracles every single service. Those close to him later described a man who gave everything he had, sometimes more than he could afford physically or emotionally. His prayer life was intense, but so was his exhaustion. He fasted aggressively, he slept little, and he carried a deep sense of responsibility for the suffering people who came seeking help. This intensity became both his fuel and his vulnerability. As his influence grew, so did opposition. Journalists began to attend meetings not to be healed, but to investigate. Critics questioned whether emotional environments influenced testimonies. Others accused Allen of exaggeration. A few former associates distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the scale of the ministry and the scrutiny it attracted. Allen responded publicly with defiance and privately with strain. He did not retreat. He did not slow down. He prayed harder. But pressure has a way of exposing cracks. Then came the incident that shifted the narrative. An arrest during a ministry trip sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Headlines moved faster than facts. Accusations hardened into assumptions almost overnight. The nuance disappeared. What remained was a simplified story, easy to repeat, impossible to correct once released. To critics, this was confirmation of everything they suspected. To supporters, it was devastating. Allen did not deny that he struggled. He addressed the situation openly, acknowledging weakness while maintaining that God's calling had not been revoked. Some accepted his transparency. Others walked away permanently. And yet, even after the controversy, the miracles did not suddenly stop. Meetings continued. People were still healed through prayer. Testimonies still poured in. This created an uncomfortable paradox. How could God still be moving through a man under public scrutiny? That question divided churches, families, and entire denominations. Some concluded that miracles proved innocence. Others argued that gifts could exist apart from character. Still others dismissed everything entirely. But history rarely fits neatly into moral categories. Those who knew Allen personally describe a man torn between divine calling and human fragility. A man who believed deeply in prayer, even when his own strength faltered. A man who refused to abandon the sick, even as his own health deteriorated. What often gets lost in the controversy is this truth. A. Allen never claimed perfection. He never taught that ministers were immune to failure. In fact, his sermons increasingly emphasized grace, repentance, and dependence on God, not human strength. As years passed, the physical toll became undeniable. Allen's body showed signs of long-term strain. Friends noticed fatigue. Travel became harder. His once thunderous presence softened. Yet he continued preaching, continued praying, continued believing that his life still had purpose. This was not a man hiding in indulgence. This was a man worn down by relentless demand. And then, quietly, without the spectacle of a crusade or the roar of a crowd, A. Allen's earthly journey came to an end. But even in death, the controversy did not rest. The official report would spark decades of debate. Critics would reduce his life to a single phrase. Supporters would push back, insisting the story was far more complex. And researchers would later uncover details that challenged simplistic conclusions. What became clear was this: the ending was not as clear as the headlines claimed. And perhaps that is the most honest reflection of A. Allen's life. Powerful, complicated, human. In the next section, we will confront the most disputed chapter of his story, examining the circumstances surrounding his death, the conflicting interpretations, and the voices that have long challenged the claim that A. Allen died an alcoholic. Because to understand his legacy, we must be willing to sit with truth, even when it refuses to be simple. As A. Allen's ministry soared, the media and public attention that had fueled his fame also began to cast long shadows over his life. For a man whose power was measured by prayer and miracles, scrutiny was an invisible burden that no sermon could lift. Every healing that stunned crowds brought questions. Every testimony that made headlines also invited doubt. And every success in the pulpit made him a target for critics who refused to see complexity in human stories. The controversy surrounding Allen's life was not limited to rumors or casual gossip. It culminated in a series of highly publicized incidents, most notably an arrest that at the time was sensationalized by newspapers and religious commentators alike. Headlines splashed phrases like "Evangelist arrested" or "Preacher in trouble," reducing decades of ministry and thousands of miracles to a few words designed to shock. But the reality of Allen's life, and ultimately his death, was far more nuanced. Many of those closest to him, including ministry partners and longtime associates, disputed the notion that he died an alcoholic. They acknowledged that Allen had struggled with personal weaknesses, as any human being might, but insisted that the claim was a misrepresentation of both his character and the circumstances of his final days. Allen's health in his later years was undeniably fragile. Decades of rigorous ministry, night-long prayer vigils, fasts, unrelenting travel, and emotionally charged meetings took a toll on his body. Friends described him as a man who gave everything until there was nothing left, and his relentless schedule often left him exhausted, dehydrated, and in pain. Yet he remained devoted to prayer, to preaching, and to his belief that God was still working through him. It was in this state that Allen traveled to San Francisco in 1970, seeking rest and medical attention. He checked into a hotel room still burdened by the weight of ministry and public expectation. And there, in relative solitude, his life came to an end. The official medical report listed the cause of death as related to alcoholism. But this statement, while technically accurate in terms of medical documentation, tells only part of the story. Those who knew Allen best, including family members, ministry staff, and historians, emphasized that the report must be understood in context. They argue that the term alcoholism in official records often encompasses a broader spectrum of health complications, including liver strain, long-term nutritional deficiencies, and exhaustion, rather than implying active habitual drinking at the moment of death. In other words, Allen's body had been worn down by decades of intensity, and the label used in the medical report does not capture the fullness of his life, his ministry, and the integrity with which he carried his calling. This distinction is critical. For decades, sensationalized accounts painted a portrait of a man who fell from grace, a preacher undone by personal vice. But when we listen to first-hand testimonies and later research, a more accurate and human story emerges. A man who battled fatigue, stress, and physical deterioration, yet never abandoned prayer or the work he believed God had called him to do. Alan's death, then, became less a simple moral cautionary tale and more a reflection on the tension between human frailty and divine calling. How does a man who heals others navigate his own weaknesses? How can someone display extraordinary faith in prayer, yet still suffer physically and emotionally? Alan's life and death force us to wrestle with these questions that rarely have easy answers. Even amid controversy, his legacy was undeniable. Thousands continued to report miraculous healings. Churches continued to study his teachings on prayer, faith, and revival. Miracle Valley remained a center for spiritual training, and his recorded sermons continued to inspire. This enduring impact stands as a counterpoint to the simplified headlines that attempted to define him by scandal alone. Moreover, Alan's story challenges a common assumption that spiritual effectiveness is synonymous with moral perfection. By observing his life, we see extraordinary prayer, bold faith, and genuine miracles can coexist with human vulnerability. Alan was neither saint nor sinner in a simple sense. He was a man who operated at the intersection of divine calling and human limitation, and whose impact cannot be measured solely by the media narratives that surrounded him. It is also important to note how this controversy affected those who depended on Alan for guidance, healing, and spiritual leadership. Many were confused, some disillusioned, yet most remained steadfast in their belief that God had used him mightily. Testimonies of healed individuals did not vanish because of headlines. Miracles continued to be reported long after his passing, reinforcing the notion that God's work is not limited by human flaws. Alan's death, then, cannot be reduced to a single label. His story cannot be summarized by a newspaper headline, a rumor, or even a medical report. To understand him fully, one must consider the totality of his life, the hundreds of thousands who experienced healing, the tireless commitment to prayer, the moments of exhaustion, and yes, the human struggles that accompanied a life lived in constant spiritual and public pressure. This recognition is critical for anyone examining his life today. It allows us to see Alan not as a figure to be condemned or idolized, but a profoundly human man whose work in prayer and ministry left an indelible mark. His miracles were real to those who experienced them. His dedication was real, and the debates over his death, while unavoidable, do not erase the transformative experiences of countless individuals whose lives he touched. In many ways, Alan's life, and particularly the controversy surrounding his death, serves as a reminder that history is rarely black and white. Headlines often simplify complexity. Public perception often distorts reality. Yet when we step back and consider the first-hand accounts, the documented miracles, and the voices of those who knew him intimately, we arrive at a richer, more accurate understanding, one that acknowledges both the human struggle and the divine calling. As we move forward in this story, it is essential to remember this tension. The next section will explore Alan's most dramatic miracles in detail, including the testimonies of those he healed, the practices of prayer that made his ministry so extraordinary, and the enduring spiritual lessons that continue to inspire believers decades after his passing. We will also examine how his ministry navigated criticism while continuing to reach thousands, highlighting the resilience of faith amid controversy. Because the true story of A. Allen is not contained in a single event, a single arrest, or a single headline. It is found in the lives transformed, the prayers offered, and the faith sustained even in the face of human limitation. At the height of A.A. Allen's ministry, his meetings were more than sermons. They were theatrical displays of faith in action, dramatic encounters between prayer and human need. From the outside, they looked almost unbelievable. Chairs lined with those who could not walk, eyes clouded in darkness searching for sight, ears straining for a sound they would never hear. And in the center of it all, Allen, hands lifted, eyes closed, voice carrying through the tent, commanding divine intervention through prayer. But these were not mere performances. Each miracle began long before he entered the tent. Allen was meticulous in his preparation. Days of fasting, hours of intercessory prayer, and a personal devotion that consumed him entirely. He believed that healing was not something he could produce on his own. It required total surrender, absolute faith, and alignment with the will of God. One of the most famous accounts came from a rural Alabama town. A young boy, blind from birth, was brought to Allen's meeting by his parents. Skeptical yet desperate, they sat in the front row as Allen prayed over the congregation. Witnesses describe a moment of silence, a hush that fell across the crowd, and then the boy shouting, "I can see!" Tears streamed down the faces of those around him. Medical documents later confirmed that the child's vision, previously non-functional, had been restored. In another instance, a woman who had been deaf for decades reported hearing her mother's voice for the first time during a crusade in Texas. "I didn't believe it could happen to me," she later said, "but when Brother Allen prayed, I could hear everything, the music, the laughter, even my own heartbeat." This testimony became one of the most widely cited examples of the miraculous results attributed to Allen's ministry. Paralysis was also regularly addressed. Men and women who had spent years confined to wheelchairs or crutches reportedly walked without assistance after prayer. One elderly man, unable to stand for more than a minute, later testified that after Allen laid hands on him and prayed, he walked unassisted across the tent floor. His story was later verified by family members who had witnessed his condition prior to the meeting. Allen never claimed these miracles as his own. Time and again, he attributed them to Jesus Christ, emphasizing that he was merely a vessel through which God worked. He would often repeat the phrase, "It is not my power, but His. I am but a servant, and He is faithful." This humility, coupled with the undeniable results, drew immense admiration from believers and contributed to the growing devotion of his followers. Yet miracles were not always instantaneous or uniform. Some healings were subtle, occurring over days, weeks, or months. Allen addressed this openly, teaching that prayer was not a magic formula. Faith was essential, yes, but God's timing, His wisdom, and the mysterious workings of the Spirit were equally important. He reminded his congregation that healing could manifest in physical, emotional, or spiritual forms, and that persistence in prayer was necessary, even when results were not immediate. The rituals surrounding these miracles were carefully orchestrated, yet deeply spiritual. Allen would often instruct the congregation to participate actively, lifting hands, speaking words of faith, and joining him in prayer. This collective engagement, according to attendees, created a tangible sense of expectation and spiritual intensity. The energy of the crowd, combined with Allen's fervent petitions, created an environment where many reported profound physical and emotional experiences. Eyewitnesses describe moments of profound awe, sudden awakenings of the blind, gasps of disbelief from families, the roar of applause, and tears streaming freely. Yet Allen's focus remained singular, directing all attention to God. He discouraged adulation, emphasizing that the glory belonged to the Lord and that miracles were evidence of divine presence, not personal prowess. Allen's radio broadcasts and recordings extended the reach of these prayer-driven miracles. Families who could not attend in person listened at home and claimed to experience breakthroughs simply through listening, praying along, and engaging with his teachings. These broadcasts became a lifeline for those isolated by geography, illness, or mobility, allowing the power of prayer to reach thousands beyond the walls of the tents. One of the most remarkable aspects of Allen's ministry was the diversity of those affected. People of all ages, races, and social backgrounds reported experiencing miracles. A blind elderly woman in Georgia, a deaf child in Kansas, a paralyzed laborer in California, each story contributed to a mosaic of faith that transcended societal boundaries. For Allen, this was evidence of the universality of God's power and the necessity of prayer in all circumstances. While miracles attracted awe and headlines, they also invited skepticism. Scientists, journalists, and religious critics attended meetings to observe, analyze, and question. Some dismissed the healings as emotional contagion or psychosomatic effects, while others demanded medical verification. Allen welcomed scrutiny, confident in the authenticity of what he witnessed. He provided testimonies, medical documents when available, and encouraged attendees to evaluate experiences honestly. Yet, despite criticism, the transformative power of these miracles was undeniable to those who experienced them. Stories of renewed hope, restored health, and deepened faith circulated far and wide, inspiring others to seek prayer and spiritual renewal. Allen's belief that God could heal through prayer became more than a teaching. It became a lived reality for thousands. The impact of these miracles extended beyond physical healing. Many attendees reported emotional and spiritual restoration, relationships mended, addictions broken, despair lifted. Allen emphasized that prayer was holistic. It touched the soul as much as the body. His teachings consistently linked spiritual well-being to physical restoration, reinforcing a worldview in which faith and healing were inseparable. Through all of this, the rhythm of Allen's life remained relentless. He traveled from city to city, praying for the sick, teaching about faith, and overseeing ministry operations. Even amid exhaustion, criticism, and personal struggle, he continued to embody a commitment to prayer that few could match. His tireless devotion reinforced the narrative that miracles, though extraordinary, were available to all who approached God with faith. And yet, as Section 3 revealed, the intensity that fueled these miraculous outcomes also exposed Allen to physical and emotional strain. His ministry was a high-wire act, balancing immense spiritual responsibility, public scrutiny, and personal limitations. Despite these pressures, Allen's focus never wavered. Prayer remained central, miracles continued to manifest, and the stories of healed lives multiplied. This section of Allen's story leaves us with a critical insight. Miracles are rarely about perfection. They are about faith, surrender, and the willingness to be used even amid human weakness. Allen's life demonstrates that divine power can flow through a flawed vessel, and that prayer, earnest, persistent, and faith-filled, can change lives in ways that defy explanation. As we transition to the final section, we will examine the lasting legacy of A. Allen, how his ministry continues to influence modern evangelists, the enduring lessons of his approach to prayer, and the way his story challenges us to reconcile human imperfection with extraordinary spiritual impact. The next section will also reflect on the controversies and debates surrounding his life, placing them in the broader context of faith, miracles, and history, revealing how Allen's story remains both inspirational and instructive decades later.
As the years have passed since A. Allen's death in 1970, the debates surrounding his life continue, but so does the profound impact of his ministry. He was a man who lived at the intersection of the miraculous and the human, whose prayers touched thousands, whose teachings inspired countless believers, and whose personal struggles serve as a testament to the complex nature of faith, leadership, and humanity. Allen's ministry left an indelible mark on modern evangelical practice. Miracle Valley, the sprawling center of his work in Arizona, became a training ground for revivalists and evangelists who would carry his approach to prayer and healing into new generations. Through recorded sermons, books, and radio broadcasts, his methods continue to influence pastors, prayer leaders, and believers who seek to experience God's power in tangible ways. One of the most enduring lessons of Allen's life is the profound importance of prayer. He demonstrated that prayer is not passive, it is a force that can shift circumstances, heal bodies, and transform hearts. Thousands of testimonies attest to this truth. People who experienced healing, restored relationships, renewed hope, and spiritual awakening. In an era where miracles are often questioned, Allen's work remains a case study in the transformative potential of persistent, faith-filled prayer. Yet his life also illustrates the human cost of relentless ministry. Allen's intensity, his refusal to pause, and his willingness to pour every ounce of energy into prayer and preaching ultimately led to physical and emotional exhaustion. His death, while officially linked to alcoholism, is widely contested by those who knew him, with close associates, ministry partners, and later researchers arguing that the narrative of him dying an alcoholic oversimplifies a far more complex reality. Allen's body was worn from decades of service, fasting, and travel, and his final days were marked by physical collapse rather than moral failure. This nuance is critical because it reminds us that great spiritual work is often accompanied by vulnerability. Leaders, pastors, and ministers are human, and even those who perform extraordinary acts of faith may struggle with limitations, fatigue, and personal challenges. The lesson here is not to idolize or demonize, but to recognize that God can use flawed vessels to accomplish extraordinary work. Faith, dedication, and prayer can operate alongside human imperfection. Another legacy of Allen's life is the power of humility. Despite the awe-inspiring miracles associated with his ministry, Allen consistently redirected attention away from himself. He refused accolades and recognition, emphasizing that God alone was the source of healing. This principle is instructive for anyone seeking spiritual impact. Humility in leadership, acknowledgement of divine partnership, and gratitude for those who participate in the work of God are key elements in sustaining long-term influence. The testimonies of those healed during Allen's meetings also continue to echo across generations. From the blind who saw for the first time, to the deaf who heard, and the paralyzed who walked, these stories remain powerful reminders of the potential of prayer. Each narrative illustrates that faith is not theoretical, it is practical, lived, and transformative. Allen's approach was not rooted in performance, but in deep spiritual conviction, a conviction that God's power was available to all who sought it earnestly. Allen's story also offers a cautionary note about public perception and media narratives. Headlines and sensationalized accounts can distort the truth, reducing a complex human life to simplistic labels. For decades, the claim that Allen died an alcoholic has been repeated without nuance, overshadowing his decades of ministry and thousands of documented healings. By highlighting the contested nature of this claim, we honor both historical accuracy and the lived experiences of those who were impacted by his ministry. This approach teaches us to seek truth carefully, to distinguish between rumor and fact, and to consider context before drawing conclusions about public figures. Perhaps most importantly, Allen's life challenges us to wrestle with the relationship between divine power and human imperfection. Miracles were not prevented by his struggles. Prayer was not weakened by his fatigue, and God's work through him was not nullified by controversy. This paradox is profoundly inspiring. It shows that the measure of impact is not perfection, but faithfulness. It demonstrates that ordinary people with ordinary flaws can become instruments of extraordinary transformation when they commit themselves fully to their calling. The enduring influence of A. Allen's ministry is also evident in the many pastors, evangelists, and prayer leaders who continued to follow the principles he demonstrated. Persistent prayer, faith in divine healing, and dedication to spiritual service remain central to countless ministries today. His teachings have become part of the foundation for modern revivalist movements, and his recorded sermons and writings continue to inspire believers worldwide. Allen's story is a narrative of tension, miracles and human weakness, prayer and personal struggle, awe and controversy. It is a story that invites reflection. It asks difficult questions. How do we measure spiritual success? Can someone flawed still accomplish great things? How do we reconcile extraordinary gifts with ordinary human vulnerability? These are questions that remain relevant, not just for religious leaders, but for anyone striving to make a meaningful impact in the world. As we reflect on the life of A. Allen, we are reminded that history is rarely tidy. The headlines, the controversies, and even the medical reports are only part of the picture. The full story emerges when we examine the testimonies of those touched by his ministry, the dedication evident in his prayer life, and the enduring principles he left behind. It is in this totality that his true legacy is revealed, a man who prayed with intensity, healed through faith, and lived as a vessel for divine power, despite the very human challenges he faced. Ultimately, Allen's life is both inspiring and instructive. It teaches that prayer matters. It demonstrates that faith can produce tangible change. It reminds us that leaders are human and that vulnerability does not negate impact. And it calls us to approach history with nuance, recognizing that simple labels can never capture the depth of a person's life. For viewers today, the story of Allen offers a profound takeaway. Miracles, prayer, and faith are not constrained by human weakness. Challenges, exhaustion, and controversy do not nullify purpose. And while headlines may fade, the lives transformed through dedication, humility, and persistent prayer endure. As the tent lights dim, the crowd disperses, and decades pass, the echoes of A. Allen's ministry remain. Blind eyes were opened, deaf ears were unstopped, paralyzed bodies walked, and hearts were forever changed, not because of perfection, but because of unwavering faith, relentless prayer, and a willingness to serve beyond personal limits. This is the story of A. Allen, the man who healed the blind, deaf, and paralyzed through prayer, who faced controversy yet remained steadfast, and whose legacy continues to challenge, inspire, and teach the world that faith can move mountains, even when the vessel is human. His story does not end in scandal, nor is it diminished by human frailty. It is immortalized in the lives touched, the prayers offered, and the enduring belief that extraordinary miracles are possible for those who approach God with faith.
The story of A. Allen reminds us that miracles can flow through imperfect vessels, that prayer can move the impossible, and that faith often shines brightest in the midst of human struggle. His life challenges us to look beyond headlines, to honor the complexity of human experience, and to recognize the power of persistence, humility, and devotion. From the blind who saw, the deaf who heard, and the paralyzed who walked, to the controversies and struggles he endured, Allen's legacy continues to inspire believers worldwide. Now, we want to hear from you. Reflect and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe miracles like Alan's still happen today? Can human imperfection coexist with extraordinary spiritual impact? How do you define true faith? What lessons can modern believers learn from Alan? Do controversies diminish a person's legacy? How does prayer shape real-life change? What story inspired you the most from Alan's life? I believed you've enjoyed this journey, so like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with friends to keep this story alive.